I have worked signals intercept for 11 years aboard Tereth Hegemony administrative vessels, and in that time I have logged more than 40,000 contacts. Most of them are nothing: debris resonance, stellar interference artifacts. The long, slow electromagnetic wash that any sufficiently populated corridor produces as a background murmur, cargo transponders, navigational pings, the tight beam housekeeping traffic of buoy stations and relay nodes, all of it folding together into a kind of noise that a trained ear learns to read the way a river pilot reads current. You feel the shape of the corridor in the signal environment. You know when something is present that wasn't there before. You know, after enough years, when something doesn't fit. The contact I logged at 14:07:44 on the 32nd day of the convoy's transit through Corridor Vethzone did not fit. I want to say that clearly before I describe what followed, because a great deal of what followed has been characterized in ways I believe are inaccurate. I was not negligent. I was not slow. I flagged the contact within 9 minutes of acquisition, and I filed a supplementary notation 6 minutes after that when the carrier encoding refused to resolve against any known standard. My watch commander, Senior Analyst Tovelhar, reviewed my notation and categorized the contact as probable colony distress signal, origin unverifiable, no action required pending standard passage. That was his determination. I disagreed with it, and I said so twice in the log. The log survives. It can be read by anyone with access to the signal's archive. I am not writing this account to defend myself. I am writing it because I am the only signals specialist from that convoy who survived, and because the full record of what I observed during those 4 hours needs to exist somewhere outside the official summary, which compresses events in ways that I believe will cause future administrative columns to make the same decisions we made, for the same reasons, with results that will not be different from ours. What I want to record before I set down the technical account is what the signal felt like, because I think that matters. I think that the reason we made the decisions we made is not only that we lacked information, we lacked the right framework for the information we had. The signal felt like distress. It had the shape of distress. Weak carrier, irregular pulse interval, encoding that read as degraded rather than encrypted. We had a category for that. We had seen it before: colony relays going down, automated beacons running on depleted power cells, the last gasp of a failing outpost broadcasting into the void because there was nothing else left to do. We had a file for that. We had a response protocol. The Hegemony's administrative transit doctrine is explicit on the matter. Signals of probable distress origin are to be logged, assessed, and if the source is within practical intercept range and the transit schedule permits, investigated. Investigation means moving toward the signal, moving closer. That is what the protocol says to do. We did not have a file for what it actually was. I should describe the convoy before I go further, because the scale of what I am about to record requires the scale of what we were to be clearly understood. The Tereth Hegemony's 9th Administrative Corridor column was 84 hulls. That number included our flagship, the Logistics Command Vessel Interminable Ledger, at 1.8 kilometers, and carrying the column's senior administrative staff, the Corridor Claim Registry, and the relay infrastructure package that was the primary mission cargo. 3 escort warbarks of the Meridian class, each approximately 900 meters, and carrying full weapons loadouts rated for engagement with pirate-grade opposition and light military contacts. 14 mid-weight administrative carriers tasked with installation and construction support for the relay infrastructure, 31 supply and fuel tender hulls, and the balance in light courier and relay vessels, including 6 fast courier hulls whose function was to carry completed claim registrations back to Hegemony core space for formal archiving. We were not a military formation. We were, in the Hegemony's designation, an administrative column. which is to say that our purpose was the assertion of administrative claim. We crossed corridors that the hegemony had marked for incorporation. We established navigational records. We installed relay infrastructure. We conducted census and resource surveys. And we logged the transit in formats that had legal standing in the Consolidated Archive. 3 escort warbarks was considered robust for such a transit. The hegemony's transit records for administrative columns of comparable size, going back 120 years, showed 0 engagements that had required more than 2 warbarks to resolve. We had never required more. No administrative column of the hegemony had ever been destroyed in transit. I want that last sentence to be understood in its full weight. Not degraded, not severely damaged, not forced to withdraw with major losses. Destroyed. The hegemony's administrative transit program had operated for more than 3 centuries at various scales, and in 3 centuries it had never lost an entire column. It had lost individual hulls, accidents, equipment failures, 2 documented piracy incidents in poorly monitored corridors, 1 engagement with a territorial claimant that had resulted in the loss of 4 hulls, and a formal diplomatic resolution. The program kept meticulous records. The records were used in mission planning. The mission planning for the 9th Administrative Corridor column had assessed the transit risk as routine. That assessment was based on the information available. I do not fault the assessment. I am recording it because the information that was available and the information that was not available is the entire story of what happened to us. I say we were 84 hulls because that is the number that entered Corridor Veth Zone. I give that number as a fixed point, a baseline. Everything that follows measures itself against that number. Corridor Veth Zone was not, at the time of the transit, in any faction's registered territory. The hegemony's survey data, compiled from long-range passive observation over the preceding 14 years, indicated the corridor was uninhabited. No population centers, no permanent installations, no registered claim by any Consolidated Archive signatory. There was some historical ambiguity. The corridor appeared in older navigational charts under a different designation, listed as part of what had once been called Ardent Compact Provisional Survey Space. But the Compact's provisional survey designations were not the same as claims, and those designations were old. The oldest references were more than 200 years back, the most recent nearly 90 years. The hegemony's legal analysis judged the corridor open to administrative claim. That analysis was correct under Consolidated Archive rules as written. I am not challenging the legal analysis. I am noting it because the corridor's history is relevant to understanding what we found in it. The contact at 14.07.44 came in on a frequency band I had never seen used for operational transmission. It wasn't unusual for individual frequency bands to go unused. There are thousands of bands in the operational spectrum, and common use clusters in certain ranges, while others see almost no traffic. But this one sat in a range that our archive flagged as technically inactive, which meant that no hegemony, consolidated, or compact-adjacent faction had logged active operational use of it in the last 400 years of records. 400 years of archive coverage from one of the most comprehensive signals monitoring networks in this region of space, and this band had produced no logged traffic, not low traffic, not intermittent traffic. Nothing. The band existed in the archive as a theoretical frequency with no associated operational history. The carrier wave was weak. Genuinely weak, not calibrated to appear weak, or so I judged at the time. The signal strength reading placed it at approximately 0.4% of normal operational broadcast power for a vessel-mounted transmitter. The pulse interval was 4.3 seconds, then 4.1, then 4.3 again, then 4. The irregularity was within the range I had seen from beacons running on depleted power sources. The interval jitter exactly matched what you see when a power cell is dropping below threshold, and the transmitter's timing circuit is drawing from a dwindling reserve. This is a specific kind of irregular. It is not random. It has a character, and that character is consistent with a particular failure mode. And I had seen that failure mode before and logged contacts that turned out to be exactly what this failure mode implies. That experience is precisely what made the signal convincing. Someone who had never seen a depleted beacon contact would not have classified this as one. I had seen 12. This matched all 12 in its jitter profile. The encoding was what stopped me. I ran it through the standard resolution suite 3 times and got 3 different partial matches, none of them complete. The suite's first pass wanted to call it a variant of the Veteran Colonial Distress Standard, a common encoding used by colony beacons throughout the Veteran faction's territory and widely adopted by smaller independent settlements throughout the region because it was open standard and broadcast friendly. But the parity bits were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Structurally wrong, in a way that should not occur through simple degradation. If the encoding had degraded from the Veteran Colonial Standard, the parity bits would show bit flip errors in a predictable pattern. What I was seeing was not bit flip degradation. The parity structure was different. The suite's second pass wanted to call it a degraded form of the old Ardent Compact navigational encoding, an encoding family the Compact had used for internal navigation systems, and which was documented in the archive from captured hardware samples. But the header structure didn't line up. The Compact navigational header uses a fixed-length preamble followed by a variable destination field. What I was seeing had a variable-length preamble and no recognizable destination field at all. The third pass gave me nothing, unresolvable, unknown family, recommend manual review. That third pass result is what made me flag it immediately rather than waiting for my scheduled log entry. Toval Har was patient with me. He is a thorough analyst and he read my flag carefully. He asked 2 good questions: whether the encoding ambiguity could be explained by multipath interference affecting the received waveform, and whether the origin bearing was consistent with any known installation or vessel track in the corridor survey data. I told him that multipath interference was possible, but that the error pattern wasn't consistent with it. Multipath interference produces phase distortions across the encoding. What I was seeing was structural ambiguity in the encoding itself, not phase distortion. On the second question, the bearing put the origin somewhere in the corridor ahead of us, and the corridor survey data showed no installations. He considered this and categorized the contact as probable colony distress signal, origin unverifiable, no action required pending standard passage. He noted that unregistered colony activity was not uncommon in survey corridors, and that an unofficial settlement running depleted equipment would explain both the unknown encoding, home-built or jury-rigged beacons often used non-standard encoding, and the signal weakness. It was a reasonable assessment. I disagreed with it, and I said so in the log, and I kept listening. At 14:51:22, the signal shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have alarmed a casual monitor or even an attentive one who was not specifically watching for it. The carrier frequency drifted by 0.04 of a kilohertz over a period of approximately 90 seconds. 0.04 of a kilohertz is a small number. In most contexts, it is a number you would not notice, and on most contacts I would not have noticed it. The automated alert threshold for frequency drift is set 2 orders of magnitude higher, because below that threshold the drift is almost always thermal noise in the receiver hardware rather than a real signal characteristic. I noticed it because I had manually flagged the contact and was watching the raw frequency display rather than the processed output. I had been watching it since I filed the flag. 11 years of professional habit. When something doesn't resolve, you watch it yourself rather than trusting the automated suite. The drift pattern was consistent with Doppler shift accumulating on a transmitting platform that was in motion. Not random oscillation, directional drift, steadily accumulating, which is what you see when a transmitting source has a non-zero velocity relative to the receiver. I logged the drift and ran a positional estimate. The estimate was crude because a single-point intercept from a convoy flagship is not a ranging array. Without triangulation, you can get a bearing but not a distance. What the drift rate gave me was a velocity component along the bearing line, and from that, a range estimate based on the assumption that the source was at some specific distance and moving at a speed consistent with a vessel in transit rather than a drifting object. The estimate placed the origin somewhere between 150,000 and 220,000 kilometers out, along the corridor ahead of us. I filed an updated notation. I flagged the positional estimate, the drift reading, and my reasoning about what the drift implied for the source's motion state. Tovelhar reviewed the update and maintained his assessment. A distress beacon on a vessel adrift, he said. The motion signature confirmed it. An unmanned vessel drifting through the corridor, broadcasting on emergency power. We were the appropriate resource to investigate. He noted that the transit schedule had margin for a course adjustment to approach the bearing. He was not wrong about the transit schedule. He was not wrong about our being the appropriate resource. He was wrong about what was broadcasting. I accepted that. I kept listening. At 17:33:09, the signal did something that I have spent a great deal of time since trying to describe accurately, because it did not behave the way signals behave. It changed harmonics. Not the way a signal changes when a transmitter adjusts its output power, or when encoding shifts, or when power levels fluctuate. Not the way it changes when a receiver's hardware drifts. It changed the way a signal changes when the signal is not one transmission, but several multiple carriers layered so precisely that standard intercept equipment, processing the combined waveform, reads them as a single source. The harmonic shift was a gap in that layering, a moment of phase misalignment so brief, 0.003 seconds, that my suite's primary processor did not flag it. The primary processor works on processed waveform snapshots. The gap was too short to appear in a snapshot. I caught it on the secondary log, which runs a continuous raw waveform capture at a sampling rate fast enough to resolve events at that timescale. I was running the secondary capture because I had enabled it after the third pass unresolvable result. Standard procedure does not require the secondary capture to run during routine contact monitoring. I had turned it on because the unresolvable encoding made me want more data than the standard suite provided. That decision, enabling the secondary capture, is the reason I can give the account that follows. The secondary log data is the only record of what I am about to describe. Without it, no one would have known. The gap lasted 0.003 seconds. In those 0.003 seconds, the secondary log showed 6 carrier frequencies running simultaneously, each on a different band, each with its own encoding profile, all of them phase-locked to produce a combined waveform that the primary processor read as a single weak signal. 6 simultaneous carriers, 6 different encoding families. Phase-locked to masquerade as one. The weak distress signal profile I had been monitoring for 3 hours was not a weak signal. It was 6 signals, carefully combined to appear as one weak signal, and the combination had held with sufficient precision for 3 hours that nothing in my standard suite had detected the seams. I sat at my console for a moment and did not move. I understand that this is not the language of a technical report. I am including it because I want the record to reflect the human experience of the realization, not only its technical content. I sat and did not move because I was updating a model that had been stable for 3 hours and the update was large. Then I filed an urgent notation and went to find Tovelhar in person. He was at his meal. He looked up with the expression of a senior officer who has been interrupted in a way he suspects may not be justified. I showed him the secondary log capture and the overlay analysis I had run in the 3 minutes since I found it. He looked at it for a long time. I watched his expression move through mild impatience to focus to something else that I will call, because I think it is accurate, the beginning of professional alarm. He asked me if I was certain the capture was valid, whether there was any possibility the secondary log was showing an instrument artifact. I told him the secondary log's error rate was lower than the primary suite's because it performed less processing. It was less likely, not more likely, to produce artifacts. He asked me what interpretations I had. I told him I could see two. Either this was a genuine technical coincidence, some combination of environmental conditions and receiver characteristics that produced a spurious multi-carrier reading, or it was deliberate. A deliberate multi-carrier transmission constructed to appear to be something it was not. He asked me what kind of party would build a deliberate multi-carrier masking transmission. I told him I did not know of any. The archive contained theoretical papers describing the technique, signals theory work from Consolidated Research, some of it quite old. The papers treated it as a curiosity. The practical obstacles were, according to those papers, prohibitive. The phase locking required would demand transmitter stability far beyond anything achievable with operational hardware. The papers described it as a capability that might be possible at some point in the future, and that future had not arrived according to any hardware data in the archive. He asked me what kind of transmitter would need to exist for the phase locking to be real. I told him it would need to be very large, very stable, and very precisely controlled. I told him that in the theoretical framework, the precision requirement scaled with the number of simultaneous carriers and the duration over which the lock was maintained. For 6 carriers, for 3 hours, the precision requirement was in a regime that the papers described as requiring a purpose-built transmitter of considerable scale, not a transmitter designed for general communications use, but one built specifically and primarily for this function. We looked at each other for a moment that was longer than it should have been. Then he picked up the command relay. Within 20 minutes, our 3 escort warbarks were at elevated readiness. The convoy formation began a slow tightening, hulls drawing closer together, escort vessels moving to flanking positions covering the ahead bearing. The watch officer ordered a full-spectrum ranging scan at maximum sensitivity, using all 3 warbark sensor arrays in coordinated mode. 3 arrays triangulating simultaneously could produce a ranging solution accurate to within a few hundred meters, at up to 250,000 kilometers. At 14:31, the scan returned a contact. At 67,000 kilometers, inside our convoy's sensor shadow. I need to explain what the sensor shadow is, because it is central to understanding how the contact had avoided detection. A convoy of 84 hulls, transiting in formation, generates a significant amount of electromagnetic interference from its own systems, drives, power generation, internal communications, navigational transponders, life support. This interference accumulates in the region immediately around and behind the formation, creating a zone where the formation's own sensor arrays have significantly degraded sensitivity. The zone is not a blind spot. You can still detect objects in it, but the detection threshold is higher. A passive hull running with minimal emissions could sit in that zone without triggering automated alert thresholds, particularly if the zone had not been prioritized for active search. We had not been searching our own shadow. We had been searching ahead and to the flanks, because that is where contacts come from. You search for what is in front of you. You do not search what is behind and around you, because things that are behind and around you are either hulls of your own formation or empty space you have already transited. The contact had been in our shadow. Not behind us, alongside us, nested inside the formation's interference envelope at a position that placed it in the degraded sensitivity zone of all three bark sensors simultaneously. That position was not a position a drifting object would naturally occupy. A drifting object arrives at whatever position physics places it. This contact was at the specific position that minimized its detection probability against our specific formation's sensor configuration. The ranging data gave a length estimate of 3.4 kilometers, cross-section profile consistent with a narrow-beam war-class hull, the long, lean form of a warship designed to present minimal profile on a direct approach bearing, not the blocky rectangle of an administrative carrier, not the wide shoulder of a cargo tender, not the sphere of a relay buoy, long, lean, the silhouette that every signals analyst knows to take seriously. One hull, 3.4 kilometers, 67,000 kilometers inside our formation, transmitting. The escort war barks requested weapons clearance. The watch officer granted it and held the weapons pending positive target identification. I ran the ranging data through every hull profile in the archive. The archive is comprehensive by any reasonable standard. The Hegemony's intelligence collections span 400 years of active observation and include hull data from 47 distinct factions and independent operators. I ran the 3.4-kilometer narrow-profile war-class contact against all of it. Nothing matched precisely. There were partial matches, near matches, overlapping envelope solutions, but no single archived hull designation produced a confident match against the length, cross-section, and transmission profile simultaneously. The archive had no entry for a hull with exactly these characteristics doing exactly this thing. I searched the Ardent Compact entry specifically because the partial encoding result on the second resolution pass had produced an Ardent Compact navigational partial, and because the corridor we were in had historical association with compact provisional survey activity. The Compact's hull registry in the Hegemony archive was, I want to be accurate here, incomplete. The Hegemony's intelligence collection on compact military assets was assessed as adequate for threat analysis purposes, but acknowledged gaps in coverage of recent commissioning activity. The most recent compact military hulls in the archive were entries made within the last 30 years, and the archive explicitly noted that coverage of hulls commissioned in the last 15 years was likely incomplete. The entry I found was War Striker, Heavy Class Ardent Compact, estimated length 2.1 to 3.9 kilometers. The range was a range because the Hegemony had never obtained reliable measurement data from a known sample hull at known geometry. All length estimates came from visual observation at uncertain angles and distances, giving a large uncertainty envelope. Weapons loadout, unverified. Drive system classification, unverified. Communication suite, unknown. Communication suite, unknown. The archive had no data on what an Ardent Compact heavy-class warstriker used for communications. That entry, Communications Suite Unknown, had been in the archive for however long this hull class had existed, and no collection effort had ever filled it in, and until 18/21/07 on this date it had never mattered. At 18/29/14, the contact broadcast on all 6 carriers simultaneously, without the masking phase lock. Full power open clean. The 6 simultaneous transmissions were no longer blended into a single apparent source. They were 6 distinct signals running at maximum output on 6 distinct bands, each with its own encoding, each aimed in every direction simultaneously. At 67,000 kilometers and full power from a hull that large, it was not a signal that traveled to our receivers. It was a signal that saturated the space around us, and our receivers were simply inside it. Every receiver in the convoy lit simultaneously. My console went white with input, not white the way a console goes white when the display is overwhelmed, but white the way it goes when the automatic gain control is ramming against its limits trying to handle input levels it was not designed to process. The suite alarmed on every channel at once. Tovalhar's station alarmed. I could hear alarm indicators from other stations through the deck plating. The watch officer ordered the escort barks to fire. All three engaged at 18:29:51. I did not observe the engagement. I was occupied with my console, because what I was seeing on my console in those first seconds required my full attention. And what I was seeing was not what I expected to see from a high-power broadcast. A high-power broadcast saturates your receivers. You see clipping, distortion, gain control fighting, all the signatures of a receiver being driven beyond its design envelope by excess input. You see noise. You do not see structure. I was seeing structure. The inputs on my console were not noise. They were, and I am choosing this word carefully, responses. My receivers were not simply saturated by the incoming signal. They were doing things in response to it. The gain control circuits were oscillating at specific frequencies that did not correspond to their normal resonant frequencies. The encoding processors were cycling through states in patterns that were not random. The carrier lock circuits, which are designed to lock onto incoming carrier frequencies and track them, were locking onto the broadcast 6 carriers one by one in a specific sequence, at specific intervals, as if following a protocol. It took me approximately 4 minutes to develop a coherent description of what I was seeing, and another 4 minutes after that before I was willing to state the description aloud. Tovalhar was at my side by then. I told him. Our receivers were not receiving the signal. The signal was operating the receivers. Not sending information through them, operating them directly. The 6 carrier waves at their specific frequencies and power levels were interacting with the hardware of our receivers in ways that the hardware's design made it susceptible to. The encoding was not data in any conventional sense. The encoding was a set of instructions, but the instructions were not for any software in our systems. They were for the physical hardware, for the circuits. The broadcast was talking to the metal and the crystal and the semiconductor substrate of our equipment, in a language made of precisely calibrated electromagnetic fields, and the equipment was responding. At 18:31:02, the first tender hull went silent on the convoy network. Not destroyed. Not damaged that we could see from the ranging scan. It was still present, still in formation position, still moving at convoy speed. But its network presence dropped. No transponder, no housekeeping traffic, no navigational ping. It existed in space, and it had ceased to exist on the network. From the convoy's perspective, it had disappeared without physically going anywhere. The second tender followed at 18:31:44. Then a courier at 18:32:11. Then 2 midweight carriers nearly simultaneously at 18:32:58 and 18:33:01. I was tracking this on the network status display while continuing to monitor my signals console, running the secondary capture, trying to log everything with enough granularity that the record would be useful to whoever came after us. I was also noticing something about the pattern of silence. It was not random. The hulls going silent were doing so in a specific order. Formation layer by formation layer, outside in. The outermost ring of the convoy's formation, the courier and relay hulls that transit at the formation's periphery, went first. Then the next ring in. Then the next. The contact was working through the 84 hulls of the 9th Administrative Corridor column the way a trained analyst works through a data set. Systematically, with no gaps, missing nothing, leaving each layer fully addressed before moving to the next. At 18:37:22, the escort bark quartered theorem fired a second salvo. I know this from Signals Officer Vethdas, who survived aboard that bark and who I have spoken with extensively since. She told me the bark fired 3 times in total. Their weapons performed correctly, normal launch sequence, normal tracking performance, target approach confirmed, proximity detonation at the appropriate range. The contact did not maneuver to evade. The weapons reached their detonation parameters and detonated. The contact's ranging profile did not change. Its broadcast did not change. It remained at the same position, the same length, the same cross-section, transmitting at the same power level on the same 6 carriers, apparently entirely unchanged by 3 salvos of Warbark weapons fire. I cannot directly verify this. I am reporting what Veth Das told me. She is a careful witness, and her account is consistent with what I could observe from the indirect evidence. The contact's persistence in the ranging scan, the continuation of the broadcast. But I want to be transparent about what is my observation versus what is hers. I have thought about what weapons fire that produced no observable effect implies about the hull's design, and I have reached conclusions I am not fully comfortable with. A Meridian-class Warbark's weapons are rated to mission-kill a hull up to approximately 1.4 kilometers in length in a single concentrated salvo. 3 salvos against a 3.4-kilometer hull would not be expected to produce a mission kill. The hull is too large. The weapons are too few. But 3 salvos against a 3.4-kilometer hull should produce detectable physical effects: ablated hull plating, drive disruption, changes to the thermal signature, some externally observable consequence of energy deposition on the hull's surface, at minimum. The ranging scan, imperfect as it was, should have shown something. It showed nothing. The cross-section profile, the thermal signature, the electromagnetic emission profile, all unchanged. The contact absorbed 3 salvos of Meridian-class weapons fire and was, as far as my instruments could determine, exactly what it had been before the first salvo. I do not have an explanation for this that I find satisfying. Hull materials that can absorb that level of energy deposition without producing observable secondary effects are not in the archive's records for any known faction's engineering program. I am aware that this sounds like the kind of statement that gets challenged in review proceedings, and I invite the challenge, because I would very much like an alternative explanation. I have not found one in anything I have access to. What I can say directly is this: at 18:39:44, the Bark-Quartered theorem itself went silent on the convoy network. A 900-meter Meridian-class escort Warbark, hardened systems, military-grade electromagnetic shielding, 3 volleys fired, crew of several hundred silent. Not destroyed, not debris. The ranging scan showed it still present, still in formation, still moving. Silent on the network the same way the tenders had been silent, the same way the carriers had been silent, the same way everything was going silent, layer by layer, formation ring by formation ring, from the outside in. I filed an entry in the secondary log. I noted the time. I noted the hull designation. I noted that this was the first military-rated hull to go silent, the 47th hull in total, and that the sequence had reached the convoy's military escort element. The Bark's going silent was the data point that revised my model most severely, and I want to explain why, because I think the explanation matters for the broader analysis. The Hegemony's military-grade hardening program for escort barks is extensive. The electromagnetic shielding is rated to operate in close proximity to active weapons fire. The communications hardware uses triple redundant systems on isolated power buses. The receiver hardware is specified to military tolerances that are substantially more resistant to environmental interference than civilian-grade equipment. When the civilian tenders and carriers went silent, I had already constructed a working hypothesis. The broadcast was calibrated to civilian-grade receiver hardware. It was interacting with specific hardware characteristics of Hegemony civilian communications equipment, and the interaction was producing the observed effects. The civilian hulls were vulnerable because their hardware was civilian. The military hulls would be resistant because their hardware was hardened. The Bark going silent told me the hypothesis was wrong, Or rather, it told me the hypothesis had been right about the first phase of the broadcast, but had not fully accounted for the second phase. The 6 simultaneous carriers were not all doing the same thing. Some carriers were calibrated to civilian receiver profiles. Other carriers were calibrated to military-hardened receiver profiles. The broadcast was not one weapon. It was a weapons suite, 6 instruments, each addressing a different target class, all operating simultaneously. The civilian hulls had fallen first not because the broadcast was directed at them specifically, but because their hardware was more susceptible to one subset of the carriers. The military hulls had resisted longer because their hardware was resistant to that subset. But another subset of carriers had been working on their hardware the entire time, and eventually it had been sufficient. I do not know how the hull's operators knew the specific hardware characteristics of hegemony military-grade equipment well enough to calibrate a carrier to it. I do not know when they learned this. I do not know whether they had access to captured hardware, or archived data, or some other source of information about our systems. I am noting it because it is relevant to the threat assessment, and because the answer to that question has implications that I believe the Hegemony Security Directorate should be pursuing. Then I tried to transmit an alert to the Hegemony boundary station at the corridor egress. My transmitter produced a clean carrier and then failed to encode. The error display read, "Carrier environment degraded, output integrity unverifiable." I switched to the secondary transmitter. Same error. I switched to the emergency relay, separated power bus, separate hardware chain, the system that is supposed to function when everything else has failed. Same error. The hull around me was fully operational. I checked. Life support nominal, gravity nominal, internal lighting nominal, drive nominal. I was breathing clean air and standing at a working console in a functional environment, and I could not send a message. The electromagnetic environment outside the hull had been rendered hostile to outward transmission by hardware calibrated to hegemony standards. Because the 6-band broadcast had saturated the surrounding space with a signal field that the hegemony hardware's error detection systems correctly identified as an environment in which output integrity could not be guaranteed, and correctly declined to transmit. The broadcast had not targeted my ability to transmit. My ability to transmit had been collateral to the broadcast's primary effects on the receiving hardware, or perhaps it had been targeted. At that point, I was no longer certain I could distinguish between incidental effects and deliberate ones. Tovalhar appeared at my station. He looked at the transmission error displays. He looked at the network status board. He looked at the ranging scan, where the contact remained exactly where it had been, unchanged, broadcasting. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him doing what analysts do when the data is not matching the model, working through the model's failure points, looking for the place where the framework had been wrong. He said, "We are not being attacked." I looked at him. He said, "I want to think through this carefully because I believe it matters for what we do next. When you attack something, your objective is to produce a physical change in the target. You want the hull broken, the systems destroyed, the crew gone, physical, irreversible. The target is the same object afterward but damaged. When you communicate with something, your objective is to produce an informational change. You want the receiver to have received a message. The receiver is the same object afterward, but it knows something it did not know before. What is happening to our hulls is an informational change. Our hulls are not broken. They are present. The ranging scan shows them. They have received a message, and the message has altered their operational state. That is not the same thing as an attack, in the doctrinal sense." I asked him what it meant that it was not an attack. He said, "It means we may still have a choice about what happens next." An attack does not give you choices. What we are experiencing may be giving us a choice. The question is whether we are willing to receive the message. The network status board showed 31 active hulls. We had entered the corridor with 84. I told him I was not sure I understood how to receive a message that was communicated by making our hardware stop working. He said, the message is not the hardware failure. The hardware failure is the carrier wave. The message is what the carrier wave conveys. He thought for a moment. He said, when we sent the convoy into this corridor, we sent it with a purpose to assert administrative claim, to say in the formal language of the Consolidated Archive that this corridor belongs to the hegemony now. That is a message. The convoy is the carrier wave for that message. The corridor's current occupant has sent a reply. The reply uses a carrier wave we were not prepared for, but it is a reply to our message. It is saying something in response to the claim we made. I said, what is it saying? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I believe it is saying that the claim is declined. I thought about that. On the network status board, another hull went silent, then another. He said, I believe that hull has been in this corridor for some time, perhaps a very long time. I believe it watched us enter the corridor. I believe it watched us transit for 32 days while we installed relay infrastructure in the first segment and moved toward the corridor interior. I believe it positioned itself in our shadow when our formation was in a configuration that made that positioning possible, and I believe it spent 3.5 hours transmitting a signal designed to bring us into the range it needed us to be in, and I believe it did all of this with a degree of patience and precision that implies it was not rushed, was not surprised, was not uncertain. It knew what we were. It knew what we would do if it showed us a distress signal. It knew how far into the corridor it needed to let us come before it spoke to us. He looked at me. He said, the message was not the broadcast at 1829. The message started at 14:07:44. The whole sequence was the message. It was just that most of the message was addressed to our response patterns rather than our receivers. The status board showed 22 active hulls. At 19:21:09, Tovolhar made the decision. He ordered emergency drive on an outward bearing away from the contact, back toward the corridor egress. He broadcast the order on the internal formation net, which was still functioning because it operated on a frequency, and encoding the 6-band broadcast had not targeted, and I have thought about why that frequency range was spared. Perhaps it was incidental, a gap in the broadcast's coverage. Perhaps it was deliberate. Perhaps the contact wanted us to be able to coordinate a withdrawal, because a disorganized, panicked dispersal of 22 hulls through a corridor in which it was operating would have been less clean than an orderly withdrawal. I do not know. What I know is that the formation net worked, and Tovolhar used it, and 11 hulls responded and began the outward run. 2 did not respond. They went silent in the time between his decision and his transmission. I was watching the contact on the ranging scan as we turned and accelerated. I want to record this precisely because I believe it is important. The contact did not move. It did not pursue. It did not alter its broadcast or its heading. It held its position at 67,000 kilometers relative to where the center of our formation had been. And as we accelerated outward, the range between us and the contact grew. And as the range grew, the effects on my console's receivers began to diminish. Not quickly. For the first 40 minutes of the outward run, I still could not produce a clean outward transmission. But the 6-band broadcast was powerful, not infinite. It had a range. We were leaving that range. At 20:03:17, my secondary transmitter produced a clean carrier and clean encoding. I transmitted the secondary log in its entirety. Everything, every timestamp, every waveform capture, every notation, every secondary log data packet. 6 bands, redundant encoding, continuous transmission for 4 hours. If any of it reached the hegemony boundary station or any relay node, it would survive regardless of what happened to us. The outward run took 2 hours and 11 minutes. 2 more hulls went silent in the first 40 minutes. After that, as the range continued to open, no further losses. 9 hulls crossed back through the corridor egress into hegemony established space, the interminable ledger, the bark-quartered theorem, 3 midweight administrative carriers, 2 supply tenders, 2 courier vessels, 9 hulls out of 84. I was at my console for all of it. I did not leave the signals station from the moment of the first alert at 1829 to the moment we crossed the egress. The secondary log ran continuously. I do not know how much of what I transmitted reached anyone. I know the data was sent. I know the data exists in the secondary log aboard the interminable ledger. I know I am alive and here to write this account, which means something that should not have worked did work, which is the only grace in the entire record as I have described it. At the limit of our ranging capacity on the outward run, approximately 800,000 kilometers, by which point our sensor arrays had degraded significantly from the effects of the broadcast, I obtained a final positional fix on the contact. It was maintaining position at the center of the corridor, where our convoy's formation had been. It was still broadcasting. The 6 carriers were still running. I lost the contact when our ranging degraded below the detection threshold for a hull at that distance, which happened before we crossed the egress, and I do not know when or whether the contact departed the corridor after we left. I do not know what the broadcast said. I have to be precise about that limitation. I have the waveform captures. I have run every resolution tool available to me and to the Hegemony's Signals Intelligence Directorate. None of them can decode the informational content of the 6 carrier streams, assuming there is informational content. The possibility that the streams carried data, that there was a message in the broadcast in the conventional sense, data addressed to some receiver other than our hardware, transmitted on frequencies and in encodings we cannot decode, is one I cannot eliminate. And the question that follows from that possibility is one I cannot answer. If the broadcast was not addressed to us, what was it addressed to? I have spent time with this question. The corridor's history is relevant here, and so are the 3.5 hours. The contact's patience, its willingness to hold its position inside our sensor shadow for an extended period, to maintain a precision masking transmission for 3 hours before revealing itself, to transmit at full power, and then simply wait while our weapons did not damage it and our hulls went silent around us, and we eventually turned and left, is not the patience of a system that was reacting to our presence. It is the patience of a system that had planned for our presence. Or something very like our presence. The compact provisional survey designations from 200 years ago. The corridor's historical association with a faction that is not the hegemony. A hull whose archive entry says communications suite unknown because no collection effort had ever produced data on it. A system that had been waiting, positioned, transmitting a calibrated lure aimed at the specific response patterns of administrative convoys before we entered the corridor, before the 32nd day of our transit, possibly before the first day of our transit, possibly for much longer than that. A system that knew what kind of entity would enter this corridor, and what that entity would do when it received a signal that looked like distress. I have set that thought down and I have not resolved it. I am not in a position to resolve it. What I can resolve is the technical record, and the technical record is complete. The secondary log data is intact. The timestamps are intact. The notation entries are intact. The waveform captures are intact. Everything that happened between 14:07:44 and our crossing of the egress at 22:44:33 is in the record, and the record can be read by anyone with access to the signals archive. What I am adding here in this account is the context that a record cannot carry. What it felt like to be the analyst who heard the contact first and could not make the people around her understand what she was hearing. What it felt like to be right and to have no way to prove it in the time before the proof became irrelevant. What it feels like now to be one of 9 survivors and to know that the thing that preserved me was not skill or courage, or anything I did differently from the 75 who did not survive. It was the secondary log capture I had enabled out of professional habit, and the transmitter I managed to reach in the brief window when our range from the contact was large enough to transmit through the degraded carrier environment. The hegemony has designated Corridor Veth Zone as administratively suspended pending further survey. I understand this designation. I believe it is appropriate in the immediate term. I also believe that the archive entry for Ardent Compact Warstriker, Heavy Class, the entry that says Communications Suite Unknown, needs to be updated, and that the update should be read by every signals analyst and every convoy watch commander in the hegemony before any further administrative transit enters any corridor with Historical Compact Provisional Survey Association. The communication suite is not unknown. The communication suite is the weapons loadout. They are the same system. The broadcast was not a distress call. It was a targeting solution. Not a targeting solution that identified which hull to destroy. It identified the entire convoy as the target and addressed itself to every receiver simultaneously, on 6 bands simultaneously, at power levels and calibration precision that our archive had classified as theoretically impossible. The distress call appearance was the targeting solution's first phase. Bring the convoy to the right range. The broadcast was the second phase. Operate on the convoy's hardware from that range until the convoy ceased to function as an administrative entity in that corridor. 75 hulls, 31 minutes for the initial phase once the broadcast went to full power. 1 hull, 3.4 kilometers, which absorbed 3 salvos of escort Warbark weapons fire without visible effect, and which remained in the corridor, broadcasting, for at least 2 hours after we began our withdrawal. I do not know where it went after that. I do not know if it is still in the corridor. I do not know what the hegemony will decide about the corridor or about the compact's capacity to deploy systems like the one we encountered there. Those decisions will be made by people with more authority and more information than I currently have access to. What I know is what I heard at 14:07:44, and what I felt when the encoding refused to resolve, and what I saw in 0.003 seconds of phase misalignment in the secondary log capture, and what I understood too slowly, not slowly by any reasonable standard but too slowly for the people around me, about what was behind the shape of distress. The broadcast was the message, and the message was the broadcast, and both of them, from the first pulse at 14:07:44, were addressed not to our receivers but to our assumptions, to our categories, to the 11 years of professional experience that taught me what a distress signal looks like, and what you do when you find one, and how you move toward it, and how you bring 84 hulls into range of the thing that is waiting for you to do exactly that. That is what I want on record, not the timestamps, not the waveform captures, not the hull designation and the 6 carrier frequencies and the formation layer sequence and the final count of 9 from 84. Those are in the log. What I want on record is this: the distress call was the weapon. The signal was the first shot. And the most dangerous thing about it was that it was right about us, right about what we were, right about what we would do, right about how long it would take us to understand what we were hearing. It was right about all of it. It always knew more about us than we knew about it. The corridor is quiet now, as far as I know. Or something in it is waiting, broadcasting on a frequency range the archive has logged as inactive for 400 years, patient, precise, with 6 phase-locked carriers ready to resolve into what they actually are the moment the next convoy reaches the right range. I cannot tell you whether that is what is there. I can tell you that I will not be on the next convoy, and I can tell you why. I am the analyst who heard the signal first. I am the one who knew something was wrong with the encoding. I am the one who enabled the secondary capture, who flagged the phase misalignment, who walked into Tovalhar's meal and showed him the secondary log. I did all of those things, and 75 hulls went silent around me anyway. And the reason they went silent is that I could not make anyone understand what I was hearing fast enough. Because what I was hearing didn't have a category, and categories are how decisions get made. And in the 3 hours between 14:07:44 and the ranging contact at 18:14:31, the ninth administrative corridor column of the Tereth Hegemony made every decision that the thing in the corridor had calculated it would make. I know this now. I knew the outline of it at 18:44:17 when I wrote in the secondary log that the broadcast was not a distress call. I knew it more completely on the outward transit, and I have known it more completely with every day since. The thing in the corridor knew us. It had been built to know us, or things like us. The distress signal shape, the specific frequency drift that reads like a depleted power cell, the encoding that partially matches 3 different known standards without fully matching any of them, those are not accidents. Those are the result of study. Someone built a hull 3.4 kilometers long around a communications system, capable of phase-locking 6 carriers in perfect coherence for 3 hours. And before they launched it, they spent time understanding what the Tereth Hegemony does when it finds an unresolved contact in an unoccupied corridor. They sent a thing that knew us. We sent a column of 84 hulls that had a file for distress signals and no file for what we found. That is what I want the record to say. I want to add one more thing, which I have not been asked for and which may not belong in a technical account, but which I believe belongs in this one. I have thought about the patience, not strategically, the way I described it earlier, not about what the patience implies for planning or positioning or knowledge of our response patterns. I have thought about it in a different way, in the hours after the transit when I could not sleep and was running the timestamp sequence in my head again and again. 3.5 hours of a signal that read as distress. 3.5 hours of a masking transmission, maintained at precision levels that our archive described as impossible. 3.5 hours of something 3.4 kilometers long, built for one purpose, waiting in the sensor shadow of a corridor it had been in for how long? We do not know. Months, possibly. The corridor survey data from 14 years of passive observation would have shown any active emissions from a hull in the corridor, and the survey data showed nothing. Which means either the hull arrived after the most recent passive survey, or it was capable of holding full electromagnetic silence for extended periods while waiting in a corridor it had been sent to hold. Sent to hold, not to attack, to hold. To be there when the thing it was waiting for arrived. To respond when the administrative column came, not by destroying it, not by driving it away with weapons fire, but by sending it a message it would understand at the level that mattered, the level of operational capability. We cannot operate in this space. This space belongs to someone who can do this to us. The message was the truth. The message was a demonstration of a truth, delivered in the most efficient way possible, by using our own hardware against us, not our weapons, our communications equipment. The thing that defines us as an administrative column rather than a military one, our ability to coordinate, to relay, to maintain network coherence across 84 hulls separated by hundreds of thousands of kilometers, that was the vector. That was what it aimed at. Not the hulls, the network, the administrative function, the thing the convoy existed to do. An attack destroys what is there. This dismantled what we were, and when we left we were still there, 9 hulls, physically intact, crossing the corridor egress and re-entering hegemony space. The hulls that went silent were still in the corridor when we left, physically present, unretrieved, broadcasting nothing. Not destroyed. Addressed. Addressed by something that understood better than we understood ourselves, what we were and what we were for and what would stop us from being it. I do not know what to do with that understanding. I am a signals analyst. I work with what I can hear and measure and log. What I heard and measured and logged is in the record, and the record can speak for itself. But I know what I heard at 14:07:44. I know what a distress signal sounds like. I know how many of them I had heard before, and I know that the one I heard on that day had been built to sound exactly like all of them, and I know that the building of it required knowledge of us that we did not have of what built it. That asymmetry is the message. That asymmetry is what 75 hulls bought us, in exchange for being the administrative column that entered Corridor Veth Zone. That is what happened in Corridor Veth Zone.